Let's make sure everybody's there, and we've got times and clocks and all sorts. So, Keri Facer is the Professor of Education and Social Futures at the University of Bristol. She was the Research Director of Future Lab and on the core team of the UNESCO Futures of Education Committee. She was also Leadership Fellow for the AHRC Connected Communities Programme. Her work is so firmly possibility studies in every single way. It involves a massive range of disciplines, mainly, but not restricted to, education, future studies and cultural studies. Her work is both theoretically and practically impactful. And I have to say, her essay in the inaugural issue of Possibility Studies in Society had a profound effect on me personally. So it gives me wonderful pleasure to introduce Keri Facer to talk to us about possibility and the temporal imagination. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's really wonderful to be here, and I want to start with a huge thanks to Vlad and Wendy and Pam and Constance for bringing us all here. I just realised I think this is my first proper conference for a really long time, and I'm trying to remember how to do it. How do we talk? What do we do? But it's so gorgeous to be with you all physically in the same place. So space and time both matter. So huge thanks to all the work and the care, because it shows such love and such commitment to some ideas, and that's to be valued, because we know it isn't always valued in the academy, but it is valued by those of us here. So thank you for that. So yes, exactly. So I'm going to talk about the relationship between time and possibility this morning. Let's start with a little quiz. Those of you who read the essay in the inaugural journal, don't answer. What can you see that's strange about this clock? Anybody spot anything about the clock? If I tell you there are no second hands on this clock, what are you seeing? 3 hands. Okay, so there are 3 hands. There's the hour hand, and then there's 2-minute hands. And this is a clock in my hometown in Bristol. It's over the market. And it's a clock that marks both London time and Bristol time. And it was a clock that agreed, basically said, OK, we're going to do London time. We know we need the railways, all that stuff. But we're also going to keep Bristol time, because that's actually when it's midday. And we're a little bit, we like being 10 minutes behind. That's how we roll in Bristol. So we've kept that. And a little bit further down, if you go to College Green, you will find a little plaque in the ground, a little brass plaque. And it's a sign, and it says, this is to mark where Greenwich Mean Time arrived in Bristol on a certain date. So basically there was some enterprising guy who connected with the telegraph and was selling people access to this particular time measure. So the reason I put this in is basically just to remind ourselves time isn't a neutral container that sits outside of us. Time is situated and it's socio-material. And the measures of time that we choose to use, and I stress choose here, and the rhythms that we choose to follow are always selected from many different possibilities, some of which are in conflict. And the main point I'm going to make today is that becoming aware of this, becoming aware of the choices that we have as we think and work with time, is something that I think opens up real possibilities for reflection and for change. So, one of the ways we can think about the ways in which we live in time is through this concept of timescapes that Barbara Adam and Rob Kitchen bring into being. And they remind us that the ways in which we decide to kind of measure our times and our days construct particular realities. So, for example, if we wanted to organize this conference around when we were hungry rather than the clock, or how long the task took, that would create a very different timescape. If we wanted to use the moon instead of the sun to coordinate our activities, that would give us monthly framings instead of daily framings. We are choosing to use the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a clock to tell us that modernity's time is up. But we could, a long time ago, have used the clocks of bodily hunger or social inequality. We are choosing which clocks to use. We also choose to use things like accounting mechanisms that discount the future. They say that in future, doing X, Y, and Z is not going to cost as much. So we're baking in certain relationships to the future. So what these things do is they naturalize timescapes for us. And they create highly diverse patterns of existence. They alienate people with different rhythms of life. They reflect social stratification, and one of the critical questions is, who decides which clock are we going to be working with? And then the temporal frames we use to construct stories of the world also matter. So just for a second, shut your eyes. Really quick response. What shape is time? What shape do you see when I think about time? Okay, we've got hourglasses. What else have we got? Nebula. A river. An infinity thingy. Yeah? Anything else? Vortex. Ooh, I've not had a vortex before. I like that. Okay, so the different cultural frames, the different temporal frames we use to think about, if you like, what time is, are socially and culturally diverse. One of the ones that I get less often when I ask this question than I did in 2006 when I first started asking it is time as an arrow, left to right, bottom left to top right-hand corner. You know the classic XY graph. That's a common image. If you're talking to classicists, they might actually tell you that the image that they have is of a descent from a previous golden age. There used to be a lovely time, now it's all got a lot worse. We've got images of flowing rivers. We've got the idea of a growing tree. So what does it mean to think that the past is underneath you and the future is above? We've got the image that I took from my friend Vanessa Andriotti, who says actually we walk into the future backwards and we see the present flow out behind us. Possibilities come from what we make, not from an array of possibilities in front of us. An image that I took from an amazing book on the anthropology, an amazing paper on the anthropology of time, talks about one place in the world where they talk about time as a pile of leaves. So the ancestors are at the bottom and the present is here, and shamanic practices involve throwing the leaves up into the air so that you can mix all the time around. We've got people who see our image of time as one of kind of running ahead and then stopping, you know, the image of the apocalypse. The Marxist among you might see images of crisis leading to transformation. Or you might, with the 14th century sociologist Ibn Khaldun, think about images of waves. You know, we're here on a wave or in a cycle. All of these construct different ideas about change, different ideas about possibility. There's a wonderful book by Naomi Claire Lazar called Out of Joint. And she talks about how some of these temporal frames are structuring political actions. And you'll see some of these are familiar. Make America Great Again is a cyclical narrative. It's an idea that we go back in time. But then this phrase, we have to get back on track. How many of us in education have been dealing with this? The language of, you know, making up for lost learning. Because apparently that's what COVID did, and apparently the job is just to go back to where we were. The frame, we have 10 years to save the planet, is an apocalyptic frame. So all of these give us different ideas about possibility. Now, for the last few years, I've been working particularly in questions of climate and environmental change. And we see that these questions of time are particularly important here. They're particularly important because our temporal assumptions frame our perception of possibility. What does the phrase, we've got 10 years to save the planet, do to our sense of what the scale of issues is that we can or should tackle? If we've got different temporal frames, we've got different conflicts. One of the big ones, one of the big conflicts, comes from majority world versus Western modernity world framing of climate. Majority post-colonial world say, the apocalypse has already happened. We've already seen the end of our civilization. So this would be Kyle White's work. Now we see a huge conflict between that framing and people in the West who are saying, our civilization is about to die. These are fundamentally different temporal narratives and they're fundamentally different starting points. The temporal framings we use also set our goals and agendas. If you look at the SDGs, for example, the one about public transport, is based on the temporalities of urban cities in the north. It's based on the idea of timetables. Now, if you work in a city that's based on relational time, where we collectively negotiate when the bus is going to leave, when we all get there, that doesn't work for the SDGs. One of the other SDGs and some of the biodiversity indicators are premised on when flowers bloom. So we can see how climate change is working because flowers bloom at different times. The flowers that are chosen are all Northern Hemisphere flowers. These are a long way away from actually where the majority of people living with subsistence farming are living. So we can see that the temporal frames are embedding particular values, particular attention, particular impacts. And then we've got the question that temporal practices lock in certain behaviours. I was thinking about that image yesterday from Hillary of the sheep in the middle of the city. And that to me is fundamentally a rhythmic image. It shows us what happens when certain rhythms change. So time matters. I also thought for this audience I'd put this one in. Unquestioned temporal tropes produce effects that are not always good. We continually frame climate change as a problem of children's futures. This endlessly defers the problem into the future. It creates a distance between adults and the issue. It depoliticizes the problem, turning it into a question of political management. And it frankly obscures the fact that climate change is having very present impacts for us today. And for those who us today are adults, in 20 years' time will not be having a pleasant time. So from a research perspective, to speak to our research questions for this conference, what would it mean to play with our temporal tropes? What would it mean to ask older adults about their futures? And by older adults, I include myself. Slightly terrifying conversation. It's one of the reasons we don't have it. And what would it mean to ask children about their experience? What have they learned? How can they bring their wisdom? So we can play with the temporal tropes and structures that we work with. The other reason I think time matters for us to pay attention to is because it's what we're living through. This is us. This is our bodies. Everything is time. We are, in Ruth Ozeki's beautiful phrase, we are time beings. What does it mean to be a time being? And if you're not sure about the answer to that question, read the poem Days by Philip Larkin, which for copyright reasons, I understand I'm not allowed to read, sadly. So what I'm arguing is that we need a temporal imagination. And I'm drawing here, Barbara Adam first uses the phrase, but it isn't very elaborated. So I've gone back to David Harvey, who talks about geographical imagination, and C. Wright Mills, who talks about sociological imagination. And I want to suggest that a temporal imagination allows us to do three things. Firstly, it enables us to provincialize and challenge our habitual conceptions of time, to see our ideas of time as situated and provisional. So that's a reflection on the self. The second thing it does is it helps us to see others, to attune to the multiple temporalities in any space. One of the things that I was thinking of as I came in here this morning was, who's been in here overnight? What's been working overnight? I've sometimes wondered, what would it be like to do a conference at night? Who would we pay attention to? What different practices would we work with? And finally, and this for me is a critical one, particularly when it comes to climate, is a temporal imagination, I think, is a precondition to helping us get into dialogue with other people who don't share our timeframes. I was working a while ago, actually a storytelling conference in Sweden, which is a whole other story. And I had a bunch of people arrive, and we were talking about sustainability. And one of the guys just sat there and just said, he said, I just don't think this is an issue. I was like, okay, all right, why is that? And we talked a lot, and it turns out he's Catholic, and he has a completely different temporal frame. And his temporal frame is there will be future redemption. Humans are just a small part of the planet. Now, that is his own position, and we need to understand that, and we need to surface it if we're going to have dialogues. So rather than simply saying, ooh, bad person who doesn't believe in climate change, actually he believes in climate change. He just is dropping it into a different temporal frame. So how do we have those conversations? Let's see if this works from a distance. Did it do that? Yes. So I'm sort of playing with this idea. This is me thinking in public. I'm not quite sure about this. I'm wondering whether it helps us to think of time as a material that we manipulate and that we work with, or time as a practice of attention that helps us focus in on certain things. And my hunch is we can see it happening. We can see it happening when somebody does something like this. When somebody like Bayo Akomalefe says, the times are urgent, we have to slow down. That, to me, is a brilliant temporal imagination move. Okay, so my roots are in education. And so I look at this sort of thing, and I'm like, well, this feels like an educational issue. This is something that we should be asking about, albeit one that's concerned with learning in lots of different places. So to make sense of that, I thought, well, let's go see what's happening in schools. Let's go see what's happening in schools around time. Now, I am not going to claim this is a massive survey of what's happening in schools. This involves me talking to some teachers and hanging out in some schools in Bristol. So I'm not going to overgeneralize this, but I am going to say that every time I've shared this, everybody's gone, yep. So when we think about where's time in our curriculum? So it appears fleetingly in lots of different places, grammar, tenses, measures, all of that sort of stuff as a property of the world. But it's fragmented, and it's dominated by a concern with chronology. Can we get kids to put things in the right order? This happened before, this happened before, this happened. And I'm just reading Tyson Yunkaporta's new book on Aboriginal thinking, and he is like, that is a particular obsession of a particular temporal frame. So we need to recognize that that's part of what's going on. The second point is that we don't actually teach our students to critically reflect upon the time technologies that are brought in. Kevin Birth, one of the great critical time scholars, says we typically end our education about time in early primary school grades and never really return to it. What this means is that what we learn about time is merely a conventional representation useful for managing primary school students and future workers. Undo the representation, he says, and one increases the possibilities of thinking about time. Now, the other thing that I find is when I talk to teachers in school about time, how are we teaching it? What's the hidden curriculum of time in schools? These are the words that we get. Insufficient, intense, frantic, rushed, rigid, threatening, controlled, pressured, finite, measured, relative, crushed, and stressed. E.P. Thompson is alive and well. Teachers saw time as something to be lost, or managed, or planned. And this next bit is the thing that really worries me. One teacher argued, we are teaching the threat of time. All of our sanctions are associated with time. You can lose time. You can fall behind. You can have time taken away. How many of us in this room are still living with the legacy of this education in time? I think it's in our bones, and it's really hard to let go. And how much of our research and our intellectual practices are structured by this legacy of thinking with time? Just a small moment. We can all go away and think about that in a minute. Okay. So, good news is there are other ways in which time is being taught and thought about in a whole range of other places, outside schools or in experimental education settings. So I want to surface these. So we can look across a whole range of different places. But I think there's 5 clusters of practices that we are seeing people really developing deep and long-lasting expertise, and some of it has been around for millennia. Firstly, anticipatory and reparative practices. Secondly, practices of temporal suspension and emergence. Thirdly, practices of relational time, rhythmic practices, and then temporal reflexivity. So I'm going to talk through these. So we have a wonderful and interesting tradition of future studies that dates back at least to the 1940s, if not earlier, and that has focused specifically on this question of how we're using ideas of the future to think about and to shape action in the present. If there are any hard questions on this particular slide, I'm going to point you to Rial Miller, who is in the audience, who can answer all the hard questions on this bit. So, but one of the things that's central to the field of future studies, like the earliest advocates for future studies, saw it as a pedagogy. They talked about pedagogic change. And in the UK and in Australia in particular, we've seen a whole load of experiments on futures education, really trying to do things differently. And then more recently, Riel in particular has pushed what he's framing as future literacy, although I would always pluralize it as literacies. We've got an ongoing conversation about that. But the main thing is here is that we've got people critically asking questions, how do we think about the future? We've also got social movement and speculative design practices. We've got the Utopian Action Research Movement. We can look alongside the movements in the Global South. We have the Futures Creating workshops. We have people knowing that how we think about the future shifts social change from the 60s onwards. We've also got now this really powerful movement of Afrofuturist and indigenous futurisms that was started often to say, why do we not appear in your future visions? And now is also saying, how can we learn from pasts to reframe futures and bringing in some really interesting conceptual frames, like the concept of Sankofa. We can always also move forward by picking up what we left behind. Okay, so really disrupting some of the linear temporalities that have framed some parts of future studies. And I also want to reference my colleague Arathi Sriprakash, who's working on reparative futures, specifically saying, how do we think about futures as a practice of care? The second cluster that I want to talk about is practices that I'm calling temporal immersion or suspension. And here we're seeing a huge amount of attention to what, from two very different traditions, which is quite weird. So Roberto Poli, who's a sociologist and philosopher in Italy, and Donna Haraway, both talk about the thick present. And they're both trying to say, what does it mean to attend to the present as a time that is rich and deep and multiple and is unfolding and emergent? The educator that I think gets to grips with this more than anybody else is Sharon Todd. And she talks about the time of unfolding, suggesting the fluidity of the present, a break not with past and future per se, but with linear time itself. And quite a lot of responses to this are drawing on things like Buddhist meditative practices and also arts practices. How do we sink into and recognize where we are now? This is an image from a few weeks ago at Black Mountains College in Wales, which is the college that we've set up to try to address climate change with an intentional reference to Black Mountain College, and the work of Jan van Berkel, which is this beautiful clay-based piece that invites, as you move around and work on each other's pieces and then mash together different shapes and frames, really invites attention to principles of emergence and exploration. The other group that I want to signal is people like Isabelle Fremeur and Jay Jordan, who are artists, activists. They live in the ZAD in Nantes in France, outside Nantes in France. And their focus is around the creation of presence, the creation of public assemblies, where and the metaphor that they're working with is the idea of composting together, and you can read the rest. So I would encourage you to check out their work. But what they invite us to do is say, what does it mean that these people are together in this place right now? How do we really sink into and work with that? We've then got practices of relational time. So the idea of time specifically as being relational with land, with more than human others. And here it's about time. We started learning from indigenous pedagogies that reframe the relationship between people and land. This is a quote from a book on indigenous learnings and futures, which argues that the future is not an empty territory to be predicted, mapped, and conquered, but a story told between the people of the past, the people of the present, and everyone, everything, all around. One of the things I've been doing recently is sinking into what do old oral stories and mythologies help us to do in terms of locating ourselves in deep time and in attention to patterns. So one of the people that I always reference is Martin Shaw. The stories we needed just came around just on time 5,000 years ago, he says. Introducing us to the most beautiful stories and the experience of listening to a story that you know has been passed down by mouth to ear to mouth to ear to mouth to ear for thousands of years. And the deep and astonishing wisdom and patterns and strange images that there are in those is a wonderful unsettling of, if you like, human-centered time. And here I also reference, although from a completely different ontology, the work around glacial time, geological time. So we see Catherine Youssef, for example, the geologist and theorist, geographer and theorist, who talks about imagining ourselves as living between two fossils. So we're living between the fossils of the oil that we are burning and we are creating the fossils of the Anthropocene. What does it mean to locate ourselves in that sort of temporality? The fourth one is rhythmic practices. Here we're seeing a huge amount of innovation in relation to playing with rhythm. I don't know how many of you have been involved in anything like Joanna Macy's grief work, but this work invites us to sit with endings, to sit with extinction, to sit with the loss of things. And we're seeing that picked up in things like the Extinction Gong, the Day of Remembrance for Lost Species. We're also seeing a huge growth in rites of passage work that are saying, actually, we need to mark the rhythms of human existence, the move from one age and one stage to another. We're also seeing people like Karen O'Brien developing things like the Sea Change Project, which is a 30-day habit-breaking activity where a group of you get together and say, we're just going to change what we do for 30 days, see if that can unsettle our rhythms. Michelle Ahadaf-Jones is doing some really fabulous work on rhythmic intelligence. I'm bringing all of this up so that you've got a sense of the richness of the possibilities and the practices that there are out there that we can draw on. You know, the way we teach time in schools is a choice. There are many, many other ways in which we can do this. And finally, there is the really wonderful growing field of critical time studies that really does beautiful things like draw our attention to how clocks are made and why they are what they are. If you look at Kevin Berth, he does some amazing stuff like getting his students to fill in their assignments according to different calendars. So are you going to use the Gregorian calendar or the Roman calendar or the calendar of the clock, which... And I mean, that sort of thing is brilliant. It's tiny, it's a micro thing. And as we know, any change in a school or a university has to go through the timetablers, doesn't it? So what would happen if we broke that? What would happen if we said, let's work with a different system? What would happen if we decided in schools not to work with an annual year, but a 3 annual? You know, just tiny things. How would it reframe our existence? One of the things I started doing recently was obsessing about, we put so much weight on this, go to university, 3 most important years of your life, you know, they're absolutely critical. And I suddenly thought, actually, I've had other blocks of time that are equally transformative. So what would happen if I thought, okay, if I thought in 3-year blocks for my, like, I could go back and say, actually, that one really made a difference. And then what does the next 3 years look like? What would happen if I put the time and care into the next 3 years that I, frankly, didn't put into choosing my university, you know? So that sort of thing, I think, we should be playing with. What are the measures that we're using? So the reason for sharing all of these is firstly because I think it's really important to start from a position of abundance rather than scarcity. There is a shed load of stuff out there that we can learn from. Secondly, they give us good questions. They invite us to ask some really interesting questions. Who are the actors in this place? What rhythms can we see? What images or assumptions about futures and past are we working with? What is unfolding now? How is time measured and by whom? But I think if we want to get towards what I'm calling temporal pedagogy, which is a critically reflexive pedagogy, it isn't just a question of picking one of those up. It's also a question of pulling this back to this question of the temporal imagination. So I'm drawing here on Gert Biester's work on public pedagogy to suggest that I think we should have 3 phases. Our first phase of any temporal pedagogy is interruption of our own temporal assumptions and habits. Our second is a practice of attunement to plural and diverse practices. And our third is an invitation to dialogue between different temporal practices. So we can think of this as what Steer and Kirsten call a meta-imaginative project. None of those 5 clusters on their own is sufficient. They all need to put into dialogue with each other. So I'm going to wrap with just some reflections on some of the things that I've been doing. The first one, yes, I am. Okay, so one of the things that I do is I invite people to write a poem in their heads, right? You're going to have 2 minutes to do this. So in your head, I want you to write a poem that starts, if I had 100 years, I would. Okay, so eyes down or into your head, you've got 2 minutes to imagine that. Okay. Now, your second poem, if I had an instant, or let's say if I was going to die tomorrow, I would. If this is the point at which some of you leave and just go off and hug your loved ones, that's also fine, okay? So the point of this, and you would normally have more time to do this, is to think about what are these frames drawing our attention to and what assumptions are they predicated on. One of the things that we know is we don't have 100 years individually, but what if we think of ourselves as part of a tradition? What if we think of ourselves as in relation with others who can pick things up? What big things would we take on that we assume are going to take 100 years, but that we put off because we think we can't do it? So, these are some of the things that we do. A second thing that I'm working on with Harriet, and we're running a workshop on this tomorrow, is visualizing time. So we're working with the river, all the stakeholders involved in taking care of the River Avon, and we're thinking, how do we make visible the many different rhythms and practices that are at stake in caring for that river? I've been working a few years ago with Penny Hay and Solvi Settemsdal on a project called Rewilding Time, and here this turned into something that was actually quite existentially challenging. We invited people, we put a massive lump of clay in the middle of a room, and we invited people, we kind of went through a ritual process, and we said, make a shape for when your life was fast. Make a shape for when your life was square. Make a shape for when time felt massively expanded. Make a shape for when time felt really slow. And people made these and they created these stories of their lives. And then, critically, we got them all to put it back into the clay at the end. So it was a transient moment. So it really ended up being a meditation on death in some ways, which I think quite a lot of this work on time is actually concerned with. It's allowing us to pay attention to the possibility of our own endings. This project was the first Council of All Beings that we ran in Sweden, which was a practice of trying to think about how to take care of this river. And this is probably the closest to a temporal pedagogy of all of these, in that it has this meta-imaginative move. So it started off with an invitation of people from biologists to historians to local activists to tell us the story of the different times of the river. So we got to really know the kind of infinitesimal times of the bacteria in the river, as well as the reeds, as well as the watermen, as well as the histories. We then walked alongside the river, and then we ran a Council of All Beings. And during the Council of All Beings, we were asking whose time should dominate, which timings should set the clock for other people. And out of that came some really quite interesting research projects. And this is a project that I'm working on at the moment as part of our British Academy project on the times of just transition, which is making a newspaper from a city where time has been renegotiated, or where there are, if you like, practices that we're trying to say, how do we organize ourselves in a different way? Because what we're trying to get beyond in this project, there's a lot at the moment that's like, oh, if we can just get rid of linear time and clock time, everything will be fine. You know, it won't. The question is how do we coordinate ourselves? How do we live in relations with other people in a practice of temporality that recognizes diversity? And it's far from straightforward. So, to conclude, nurturing the temporal imagination for me matters because our current political temporalities, the time of the clock and the language of time as scarcity and threat, is not serving us well in a warming world. We need new ways of thinking with time and making sense of it. We need to find new ways of talking with each other across temporal traditions and across different practices of synchronization. And the educational task under these conditions is far from trivial. It's to help us let go of naturalized, habituated, and embodied concepts of time that have served us so poorly to date, and open up the possibility of a richer temporal imagination. And my hunch is, this second bit is a hunch, my hunch is that in doing this, we get an ethic of listening and inquiry to each other and to the multiple and contested times in which we're living. And I am going to also just skip forward a second and show you this. So for our work here, this is part of a book with Johan Siebers and Braden Smith that we developed, which was about reflecting on our own temporal practices as researchers. And we produced a little manifesto about it, which effectively says, how are we working in time as researchers? So that is it from me. Many thanks to all of these lovely colleagues and who've all played a big role in all of this thinking. And that's where you can go and find out more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I want to say that was perfectly to time, but it kind of feels like that would be wrong, right? So thank you very much. Within a conception of linear time, which we rule by the clock, you've given us enough time to be able to have questions before the coffee arrives. So do we have any questions? Yeah.
I just had a comment. I found myself really resenting the fact that we didn't have time to embrace any of this.
Yeah.
It was so, the rapidity of this was so...
I'm aware of that, yeah.
Yeah, and it's really a dissonance for me right now.
Yeah.
So just a thought, comment.
One of the things as soon as you start working on time is you end up realizing just how temporal structures are. And it's, I think what happens is you make a judgment. You make a judgment. And one of the judgments I make is I give you this in the knowledge that you have other time and we have the rest of the week and that there is space. So one of the things that to me often happens in these sessions is, but I want all of this now. We don't need it now. So yeah, I'm with you. And it's, the question is, how do we want to coordinate ourselves? What practices do we want to use? And maybe it is time sometimes to do a really different conference. Exactly. Should we create conferences where we sit with one person for like 3 days and just deepen, you know? And in the current economy of academia, that's a tricky thing to do. So, you know, yeah. Anyway, I'm with you.
Thank you. We have a question over here.
Yeah. Hi, Keri. Thanks.
Oh, of course. Hello, Riel.
Wonderful, beautiful, and thank you for that. Horizon kind of scanning of all the things that are happening. Just one aspect that I wondered if you would just explore a little further, which has to do with, and this won't surprise you, if we take the hypothesis that our imagination essentially emerges from what we would call anticipatory systems and processes that are embedded prior to humans, meaning it's a biological characteristic of all living organisms, how would you play that into the research and the work that you're doing? In other words, thinking about how anticipatory systems and processes in their diversity generate the temporal metric that's relevant to the anticipatory system.
So I would say you are setting anticipatory systems and processes as primary to everything else. That is a longer conversation and one that is not for here. However, if I accept that premise, then I would say actually then we have a really interesting conversation about the forms of relationship with time that emerge from that. Absolutely. I mean, that's where we go. It's a pluralizing question and it's something for us to explore. Yeah.
Any other questions? I feel there was something going on under time on that. Yes, we've got some over there. Penny.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Keri. Ooh,
hello.
Brilliant as always. I have a question about your comment about children are not the future. Or you didn't say that. You said you question the phrase children are the future. And the piece that Noah Sobe wrote from UNESCO on that as well. I know that you know that. Yeah. But just in terms of children and alternative futures in relation to hope, especially Joanna Macy's work around hope and hopeful futures, and especially in relation to climate anxiety. I'm asking you lots of things all at once, but can you just say something about that? Because in terms of our commitment, I know that we share this in terms of future generations, times are really urgent.
So What I've noticed in the last 5 years of working on climate change and education is the extent to which adults are projecting onto children their own anxieties. And they are projecting their own anxiety about their own futures onto kids and saying, if we can just get kids to be worried enough about the future and protest, then that's a way of making change. And to me, that says a lot more about adults' sense of depoliticization and lack of their own work on that. So that's the thing I'm pushing back on. So there's an unwritten paper I have on climate education as terror management. There's a great paper on terror management theory. And really, you know, we have to be super careful of that response. So, and if you look at all the work on climate denial and socially organized denial, one of the key categories of socially organized denial is to say that something is a long way away, either spatially or in time. So what happens when we start anchoring climate change as a concern with our children's futures is that we anchor it a long way away in time in most people's minds, even if it's actually next week. So I am not saying that we shouldn't be concerned about the futures of our children. I'm asking a couple of questions. One, is it strategically useful to operate with that sort of frame? And two, if we want to make the sort of substantive changes that are needed, we need to be focusing on adult education. That's where I'm at with this. We have got huge sustainability challenges happening in loads of different places. The whole climate framing is potentially problematic because that's a spatial framing that says this is a global thing that we manage through global management. The consequences of which, unfortunately, are things like what's happening here in Cambridge, which is an investment in geoengineering and technocentric solutions. So if we trouble both the spatial universalization and the temporal universalization, what that allows us to do is say, where are the battles? And we're all near them. We're all near them. In Bristol, for example, we're having a discussion. One of our motorways is basically going to fall down. And the assumption is we spend 200 million on repairing it. That motorway is over a river that is currently culverted. That river has a very different potential future relationship with the road. So I cannot fix climate change. I can work in a situated way around that particular challenge. And then what I can do is network with other people who are working in situated ways on theirs. And then collectively, we can produce and start to embody models that allow us to do things differently. So that's the reason I'm pushing back on the framing of children and futures in climate that I think is, it's like Michelle Bastian talks about, charismatic megafauna. She says there's a kind of charismatic temporalities that kind of crowd out all the others. And the children are the future, charismatic temporality crowds out all the others. And also, from my other work, gazillion years ago, on education and technology, the risk of framing children and futures is it stops us seeing children in the present. Who are you now? Who are you now? What can you become now? And how do we allow you to avoid being taken over by these very limited images of the future? So I think for both practical reasons, i.e. we need to move fast, and for kind of ethical reasons, we need to really trouble that framing. Yeah.
Fantastic. I think we've got time for one more question. Yeah.
Sorry, Keri, that was so inspiring. I'm so inspired, everybody. I've just got a couple of inspired thoughts, not inspired by me, but by you. One is this idea of queering the form of time.
Yeah.
So I loved your criticality around time, and one of the things I'm really fascinated by, because big plug, Treescapes project coming on next, is how do you look at time through other lenses? So, for instance, a tree, we're obsessed with tree rings. If you did that, what would happen? Also, Tim Ingold gave this talk, which I did not understand, right? Completely not understand, which is about genealogy, drawing on his Sami anthropology and tree rings. Everybody looks confused. That's exactly kind of what I thought would happen. But I think one of the things about that is that it's starting to create these spaces of thinking. And there was a bit you skipped over, about that, which I thought maybe you could talk about a bit more about what could happen if you did this work. That's the question.
So 2 things. One, Elizabeth Gross and 2, Lee Edelman are writing on queer futuring
Yes.
and queer time and
Yes.
have been for a long time.
Good.
So we should recognise them. We should also look at the work on Crip Time, which is working with disability studies and the time of differently abled bodies and what that does to time. These are 2 really, really important ways of troubling heteronormative body time. So to look at those. Second thing is, there is a lot of work. There is a lot of work on trees and time and climate, and it's growing and it's everywhere. And the reason I put those 5 categories into dialogue with each other is because I think, on one level, we need to go into these lenses. We need to think about what does time look like from the perspective of this tree. And we need to be able to move out of it into other places, into the times of kind of politics. So what I'm trying to do with this is propose a dynamic practice that doesn't get us settled into, you know what, if we're all only slow, it'll all be fine, right? Or if all we do is kind of listen to these other times, we'll be okay. It's actually, no, we need to be able to move between them and ask, what is this lens allowing us to pay attention to? So it's at the same time as we ask the question, what do we pay attention to when we're thinking with the tree? There is also the question, what are we not paying attention to when we're thinking with the tree? And this is what I mean about time as attention. It's choosing, it's helping us focus in on certain things, on certain values, and not others. So we need to be constantly reflexive and aware of that and make our decisions in a situated way, making sure that it's not just us in the room.
Perfect. That was great. Thank you.
Fantastic. I think now the space for this has ended and a new space is opening out there. So I want to say thank you very much, Keri. That was really, really fantastic and really, really inspiring. Thank you.